Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this video lesson on civil rights. This is part 1 of 4 video lessons, so without further ado, here we go. All right, so key vocab we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the definition of civil rights. We're going to discuss the Black Codes, the Dred Scott decision, Jim Crow, Reconstruction amendments, certain barriers to voting, and the very important Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson from 1896. All right, let's start out with a little brief introduction to civil rights. Civil rights refer to those things that the government must do to provide equal protection and freedom from discrimination for all citizens. The root of this idea of this government protection comes from the 14th Amendment of the United States that was passed in 1868. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And the rights of people, basically, it's the rights of people to be treated without unreasonable or unconstitutional differences. Okay, what is the 14th Amendment? There it is. Well, there's a lot more to the 14th Amendment than this, but the particular clause that concerns us is this one. This is called the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment, and it says, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." This is where civil rights comes from. This is where the government's ability to legislate about civil rights or for or in favor of civil rights comes from. It is justified by this clause in this amendment. So let me give you a brief historical timeline here. I've got some visuals for you. We'll do this on a couple of different slides. But if you go over here, we'll start at the left-hand side. This is the first one here. This timeline that I've broken up into a couple of different parts traces and highlights significant events in United States history that advanced civil rights. So we start out with 1820 and 1861. Okay, in 1820, the Missouri Compromise is created, so the U.S. is made up of 12 free states and 12 slave states. This issue of civil rights and based on race has been an issue almost since our founding, but it started coming to a head in the 1800s. All right, and then in 1861, the southern states secede, the Civil War begins. We can go into the historical breakdown of what caused the Civil War. Was it slavery? Was it other things? That's a history thing. That's not the subject of this. But suffice to say that slavery and civil rights were a big issue during that era. In 1863, President Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, that frees all slaves only in the rebelling states. I do have to point out this historical inaccuracy. Abraham Lincoln was not the great emancipator. He was not in favor of political, cultural, or social equality. This was not what he was about. He was about maintaining the Union. So the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to the states that were in open rebellion, the states that had seceded. The border states that still had slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to them. So it's important to note that. So in 1865, Civil War ends. The 13th Amendment was passed shortly thereafter, abolishing slavery and involuntary servitude. Okay, this is what made slavery illegal. In 1868, we have the passage of the amendment I just talked about. The 14th Amendment, equal protection is guaranteed and promised to all persons under the law. Then in 1870, the 15th Amendment is passed, stating that no states may deny voting rights based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In 1896, the Supreme Court approves the doctrine of separate but equal. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then we're going to move up over here, and we're going to flash forward several decades. In 1954, Brown versus Board of Education overturned this segregation. It banned segregation in schools. So this is where we had massive changes in civil rights, and that's the birth of the modern civil rights movement. Also in 1954, Rosa Parks is arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the bus to a white person. That leads to the Montgomery bus boycott. 1963, Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech during the March on Washington. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act passes. We'll talk about that. In 1976, Black History Month is established for February, or February is established as Black History Month. And in 2003, the Supreme Court rules that race can be considered as one of the many factors in college admission. So that's a brief overview of civil rights in the United States. Here's another graphic that I found online that I thought was pretty cool. This is the top half of the graphic. It's actually much larger than this, but for the sake of good visuals, I broke it in half, and the next half we'll see on the other slide. Over here on the right-hand side, or I'm sorry, the left-hand side, you see it's 1957 through 68. That was a big, big period of time for civil rights. But we're going to start over here, 1890 to 1965. Black codes and Jim Crow laws were passed by the Democrats to suppress the constitutional rights of blacks, such as separate but equal laws and anti-voting efforts like poll taxes and literacy tests. We will talk about the black codes and Jim Crow in a minute. 1918 and 1924, a Republican introduced anti-lynching bill in 1918. Mostly GOP votes passed the bill in the House. The Democrats opposed it, but Senate Democrats block any vote, period. And you can read this yourself. I just wanted to put this up here as a nice visual to give you a play-by-play of how civil rights worked. You can look at this at your leisure. And then here's the second half of that graphic, and you can see where I got it from. This is the source, so feel free to go check that out and see what you think about it. All right, here's yet another graphic. This one is from PBS. And again, this is just to give you a variety of different visuals to look at to see what helps you study best, what helps you understand best. Whichever of these visuals makes the most sense to you, please feel free to use that as a study tool. This is one half of the chart, and now here's the second half. So feel free to examine both of these items at your leisure. All right, let's talk about the Dred Scott decision. In 1857, and this is before the war, Supreme Court declares that blacks, free or slave, they're not citizens. They're not people. And because they are not citizens, they are not people, a person under the law, they cannot sue for rights. The Supreme Court declared that Congress cannot legislate slavery and actually declared unconstitutional the Missouri Compromise. And because they declared this compromise unconstitutional, it increased tensions between the North and South, and this is one of several things that was a prelude to the Civil War. So this is a big decision. Dred Scott decision, 1857, big picture. It declares that blacks are not citizens. Okay, they're not people under the law. Reconstruction. Now we're flash forwarding to after the Civil War. We have what are called the Reconstruction Amendments. There are 3 of them. The 13th, forbids slavery. The 14th, equal protection and citizenship. The 15th, black men, not women, get the right to vote. We'll talk about women in another presentation. This changes the relationship between federal and state governments because now the question over who has the most authority and power, is it the federal government or the states? It's the federal government. The Civil War settled that question. The Union Army attempts to enforce the new amendments, but the South resists. Okay, they accept preserving the Union, and they have to deal with abolishing slavery, but they block at every opportunity any granting of legal and political rights to blacks. Okay, so it's very important, and this is where we get into the black codes and into Jim Crow. So, black codes were basically a list of rules, of laws, if you will, or ordinances that all slaves had to follow. They couldn't leave the plantation without permission. They couldn't carry guns. They couldn't testify in court. The whole laundry list of items that the things they could not do. Jim Crow was a rehash of the black codes, basically neo-slavery, new forms of slavery or near slavery. They introduced this thing called sharecropping, which was basically servitude, again, because they would allow the newly freed slaves to rent the land that they owned, and they wound up farming the land in very similar fashion to what they did when they were actually slaves. Southern Jim Crow laws encouraged segregation and degradation. Northern white leaders largely ignored the terrible treatment of blacks in the South. Supreme Court upheld segregation all the way up until 1954, and segregation also appears in the North. Everybody thinks of this as a Southern thing, but really that's not the case. The North was very much involved in this segregationalist attitude. Right, so early legislation, we had some civil rights acts that were aimed at the southern states that passed the Congress. They attempted to prevent states from passing laws that would circumvent the amendments. Many of these things were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. There were several civil rights cases. Like I said, they invalidated virtually all the civil rights legislation and said that all of that was unconstitutional, and that wouldn't change until 1954, and that marks a significant moment in time. So Plessy v. Ferguson establishes the separate but equal doctrine, the idea that blacks and whites should be kept separate, but that they would have equal schools and equal facilities, which of course was total, it was not true. I can think of a word for it, but it's not appropriate for a video lesson. But it was complete bunk. It was not accurate at all. They were not equal, but they were in fact separate. So this contributed to segregation, especially in the South. There were a lot of voting barriers, a white primary, the grandfather clause, which said if your grandfather voted, and only if your grandfather voted, then you get to vote. And of course, all the newly freed slaves, none of their grandfathers could vote, so that completely wiped them out of suffrage, period. Poll taxes, when you showed up to vote, you had to pay a tax. And then literacy tests, ridiculous tests that the smartest PhD that currently exists couldn't pass. They were ridiculous tests to keep black people from voting. White supremacy was upheld outside of the law. Private citizens did whatever they could to enforce white supremacy and segregation. The NAACP was established in 1909, and its primary way to fight inequality was using the courts. And it should be noted that the NAACP was founded by both white and black people. This was a multiracial, multi-gender endeavor, and many folks of different backgrounds came together because they all believed in equality for all people. And that's an important item to note. I think that gets lost when we have these discussions about race nowadays, that there were several different races and both genders were involved in fighting this good fight. Now, that wraps up our lesson for Civil Rights Part 1. I will see you guys in Part 2, where we're getting to some additional special topics. We're going to talk about the modern civil rights movement in Part 2. See you then.